The mainstream narrative calls the Children's Crusade a pious failure. The primary sources call it something else. A chronicle written in 1213 describes boys and young men who abandoned their plows and flocks, marched across Europe without weapons or papal approval, and reached the Mediterranean expecting a miracle. What they found instead turned out to be a trade network that had moved European slaves to North Africa for generations. The real story isn't about faith. It's about what happens when a civilization stops protecting its own. You cannot understand what happened in the summer of 1212 without understanding what had already gone wrong. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade ended with Christian armies sacking the Christian city of Constantinople. They never even reached the Holy Land. That disaster had happened only 8 years earlier, and it shattered the credibility of official crusading leadership across Europe. The wound went deeper than one failed campaign. At the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Muslim forces under Saladin had captured the true cross, the most sacred relic in Christendom. 25 years later, that loss still burned. It meant that the kings and popes who had promised to reclaim Jerusalem had instead lost its most powerful symbol, and then burned their own allies in Constantinople. A generation had grown up knowing only defeat. By the spring of 1212, the pressure had become unbearable. Muslim forces had invaded from North Africa and captured the castle of Salvatierra in Spain. Pope Innocent III held emergency processions in Rome on May 16th to beg God for deliverance. Similar processions likely took place at Chartres in France. The official machinery of holy war was grinding again, but it had already failed too many times. The people who would join the Children's Crusade had watched kings return from the East with nothing but debt and shame. This was the atmosphere that produced Stephen of Cloyes. When a 12-year-old shepherd boy near Vendome claimed that Jesus had appeared to him disguised as a poor pilgrim and handed him a letter for the King of France, the timing wasn't random. Stephen stepped into a vacuum that the official church and the crowned heads of Europe had created together. They had promised salvation and delivered catastrophe. Now a child was promising what the institutions could not. The chronicler of the events wrote that the participants left their plows, their carts, and their flocks, driven by what he called a spirit he could not name. They abandoned everything because they believed the official path had already failed. But the official path was about to prove safer than the one they chose. Stephen's letter has never been found, and no chronicler records what it said. That absence matters. If the king had taken the boy seriously, we would know the contents. Philip II didn't take him seriously at all. He ordered Stephen and his followers to disperse, acting on advice from the University of Paris. The king had just spent years fighting Richard the Lionheart and consolidating his own power, and he had no patience for a peasant child disrupting his kingdom with unpaid holy war. But Stephen refused to go home. He began preaching at a nearby abbey, and his following grew. By June of 1212, he had assembled a crowd at Saint-Denis during the Lendit Fair. Contemporary estimates range from 15,000 to nearly 30,000 people. Most were children and adolescents, though mothers, laborers, and the elderly joined as well. They weren't soldiers. They carried crosses and banners, not swords. They believed that their innocence would succeed where armed crusades had failed, and they believed the Mediterranean Sea would part before them, just as the Red Sea had parted for Moses. From Saint-Denis, Stephen led them south toward Marseille. They survived by begging for food along the roads. The vast majority turned back once they understood what the journey actually meant. Hunger and exhaustion did what the king's orders could not. Villagers along the route saw ragged columns of children and poor adults passing through, some singing hymns, others already silent with fatigue. By the time the remaining group reached the coast, they were starving, footsore, and waiting for a miracle that didn't come. But the sea stayed exactly where it was. That's where the schoolbook version usually ends. Two men were watching the docks. Hugh the Iron and William of Pasquares were French merchants who offered to carry any willing passengers across the water for a small fee. They owned ships, they possessed the experience, and they knew the routes to North Africa. They didn't have Jerusalem in their plans, and what they did have in mind would make the failed miracle at the shore look gentle by comparison. While Stephen's followers were learning that the Mediterranean doesn't part on command, another shepherd boy was leading thousands over the Alps from Germany. Nicholas of Cologne came from the countryside near the Rhine, and he carried a Tau cross as his emblem. He claimed that an angel had commanded him to lead a crusade, and he invoked the biblical Exodus directly. The sea would open for them. God had done it before, and he would do it again. Nicholas led his followers south through Mainz and Speyer in the early spring of 1212. The Alpine crossing was brutal. These were not equipped travelers. They were peasants in poor clothing, carrying what little food they had, walking into mountain passes where snow still lingered in May. Alberic of Troisfontaines records that 2 out of every 3 people on that mountain journey died from cold, hunger, or exhaustion. Bodies were left in the snow. Families that had sent their sons and daughters off with prayers received no word back. Those who survived arrived in Genoa in late August, roughly 7,000 people still standing out of many thousands who had started. They marched to the harbor and waited for the water to divide. It didn't divide. Some of them accused Nicholas of betrayal. Others settled down to wait, convinced that God would change his mind. The Genoese authorities saw an opportunity. They offered citizenship to anyone who wished to stay, and most of the would-be crusaders accepted. What had begun as a popular religious movement ended, for many, as a labor migration into Italian cities that needed cheap workers. Nicholas refused to accept defeat. He traveled to Pisa and then to Rome, where he and his remaining followers met Pope Innocent III. The Pope praised their enthusiasm, which was a polite way of saying he would not help them. He told them they were too young for a crusade and ordered them to return to their families. It was the same dismissal the French king had delivered, dressed in different robes. The remaining Germans headed north. Nicholas tried to cross the Alps a second time, and he died on that journey. When word reached Cologne, the families of those who had perished were not satisfied with sorrow. They arrested Nicholas's father and hanged him. The movement had consumed its own prophet, and then it had consumed his family. Back in Marseille, the worst outcome was unfolding. Hugh the Iron and William of Poitiers loaded their passengers onto ships. Some accounts say that these vessels sailed not toward Jerusalem, but toward North Africa, where the passengers were sold into slavery in Tunis. Other accounts describe a shipwreck during a gale off San Pietro Island near Sardinia, where more of them drowned in sight of land they would never reach. The Chronica Regia Coloniensis, written in 1213 by a monk who lived through the events, puts it plainly. He says that some of the Crusaders got to Marseille, but whether they crossed to the Holy Land or what their end was, he doesn't know. Then he adds the line that the sanitized narratives avoid. One thing is sure, that of the many thousands who rose up, only very few returned. That's not a story about a miracle that failed. That's a story about mass disappearance. The 13th century Mediterranean was not empty water. It was a trade corridor, and one of the commodities moving through that corridor was human beings. European slaves were sold in North African markets, while North Africans were trafficked into European ports. Genoa, Venice, and Marseille all profited from this traffic. Italian and French merchants had been running these routes for generations. They knew the ports, they understood the buyers, and they recognized that a group of desperate, unarmed peasants with no protectors made ideal cargo. The merchants who offered passage to Stephen's followers didn't need to invent a new crime. They only needed to recognize desperation when they saw it, and they knew exactly where to unload their cargo. Modern historians still debate whether the participants were truly children, or whether the word pueri meant simply the powerless, the landless, and the poor. Peter Riots argued in 1977 that the movement was composed of wandering adults, not kids. Gary Dixon pushed back in 2008, insisting that children did play a central role. That academic argument has value, but it can also become a distraction. Whether they were 6 years old or 26, they were vulnerable people who had been told by every official source that Jerusalem mattered more than their own survival. And when they acted on that belief, the institutions that had planted it in their minds offered them nothing except permission to go home. The standard version stops at the sea, refusing to park for a simple reason. The full story indicts too many people at once. It indicts the kings, who ignored the movement until it became inconvenient. It indicts the church, which recognized these crusading vows as valid in 1220, when Pope Honorius III absolved a poor student named Otto from his vow, yet never acknowledged the institutional failure that sent thousands into the Mediterranean with no protection. And it indicts the merchants who treated human desperation as inventory. The traditional narrative prefers to frame this as a tragedy of innocence, as if the only lesson is that the world is cruel to children. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that a civilization under sustained pressure produced a movement it could not control. And then it allowed that movement to be consumed by the same trade networks that connected Europe to Africa for profit. The primary sources don't flinch from this. We do. The Chronica Regia Coloniensis called the event unheard of throughout the ages. The chronicler was right. But what is even more unheard of is our willingness to look at what the sources actually say, and to ask why we prefer a softer story instead. The answer is uncomfortable. If we admit that the merchants of Marseille sold these people into slavery, we must also admit that the civilization that produced them abandoned them first. If we admit that, we have to look at our own institutions more carefully. Pope Innocent III watched the Children's Crusade collapse, and within a year, he was using that same religious energy to launch the Fifth Crusade. He learned that the enthusiasm wasn't dead. He simply needed better control over where it went. That is the real pattern. The vulnerable provide the passion, and the institutions provide the direction. When the two become separated, the result is what happened at the Marseille docks in 1212. If you want to see how that pattern continued, the Fifth Crusade is waiting. Subscribe, and we will pick up exactly where the institutions left these people behind.